Welcome to another episode of the Nintendo Chronicler. In today's episode, we are going to be tackling one of my favourite subjects, a Nintendo IP that is both obscure and relevant at the same time. I love it when the niche things I enjoy get to have a more prominent spot in the limelight. And well, Another Code isn't as niche as some other Nintendo IP out there, but it is a game firmly placed specifically in the 7th generation of gaming, and has made little noise since then. Until now, with the launch of Another Code Recollection on Nintendo Switch. So, to celebrate, I am going to take us back to how the series began, how it developed, and hopefully convince you why Another Code is actually a fairly important series in the history of Nintendo. Now, let's see what we have in store for this episode. The history of Another Code is tied hand in hand with the history of the company that made the game, Cing. So, an exploration of Another Code will also require us to explore the history of this once great member of the Adventure Game Developer Club. Cing opened its doors in April of 1999 and was founded by Takuya Mitagawa, the company's president, CEO, and producer on all of their titles, and Rika Suzuki, the vice president, writer, and designer for many of Cing's games. Mitagawa and Suzuki first met at Riverhill Soft Inc., a Japanese game developer that Suzuki herself co-founded in the 1980s, and specialised in making games in the Japanese adventure genre, mainly for Japanese PCs. The company's most famous series was the J.B. Harold series of games, with Mitagawa finding his start as the programmer for the second game in the franchise, Manhattan Requiem. The J.B. Harold IP is actually a well-beloved member of the adventure game genre, being released in the US for DOS computers and selling a collective 200,000 plus copies. The original game has even gotten a full remake on Nintendo DS, iOS, and Nintendo Switch in Japan. Eventually, Riverhill Soft expanded their output into other genres and systems, developing the Burai franchise of RPGs, the Overblood series of survival horror games on PS1, which came out the same year as Resident Evil, and helped port games like Prince of Persia and Tactics Ogre to new systems. It even published some Western-made games in Japan, like the Neverhood series on PS1. Unfortunately, Riverhill Soft Inc. wasn't to last, as both Suzuki and Mitagawa would leave the company after the release of Overblood 2 in 1998, and they would form Cing. From then on, Riverhill Soft would go on to lay off many employees and file for bankruptcy in 2004. I don't think Suzuki and Mitagawa leaving the company was the reason why it went under. Rather, I think they saw the writing on the wall and were not enjoying the direction Riverhill Soft had gone in, as by the late 90s they were no longer making their own adventure titles and were focused on publishing other developers' games on PC instead. So Cing was formed with the intention of providing gamers with new and unique video game experiences on consoles and handhelds. The first game made by Cing was the PS2 adventure title Glass Rose, developed alongside Capcom. The game was intended to be a big success for both companies, even using the likeness of Japanese celebrity Masahiro Matsuoka for the main character. But the game bombed in Japan, as reviews were mostly unfavourable, and it never released in America, although it did see a short European release. It wasn't a great start for Cing, but behind closed doors, Mitagawa was forming a strong relationship with Nintendo, and in early 2004, development would begin on the star of this video, Another Code. When thinking about their next project, Mitagawa and Suzuki's past experience with adventure games pushed them towards making another title in this genre, especially as many of the new staff at Cing had grown up playing the J.B. Howard adventure titles and were keen to work with the duo on something similar. This included Taisuke Kanasaki, a graphic and character designer who was about to make his directorial debut with Another Code, a game he also acted as character designer for, creating Ashley herself, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Mitagawa approached one of the younger producers at Nintendo, Satoshi Kira, with the Another Code project. Kira was familiar with Mitagawa's and Suzuki's history in the adventure game genre, and so helped pitch the game to Nintendo in February of 2004. By all accounts, there was a lot of pressure to impress Nintendo. They had a history of popular adventure games with the Famicom Detective Club series, and helping to get the Ace Attorney franchise at Capcom off the ground. But in 2004, the company itself hadn't really dived into the genre all that much. The Nintendo 64 lacked any Japanese adventure titles from Nintendo, and other than the aforementioned Ace Attorney games, which Nintendo didn't make themselves, the Game Boy Advance also lacked many Japanese adventure games. So, using this gap in the market, the team were able to successfully pitch Another Code to the Big N, and work began. But not for the Game Boy Advance. Instead, it began for the still in development Nintendo DS. Development for the DS was described as being tough at first, and this was because Nintendo didn't give the team any hardware to work with. They were told about the two unique features of the Nintendo DS, its touchscreen and its dual screen layout, and that was it. For the first part of development, they had to make the game for PC and laptops and then move it over to the DS when they finally received the dev kits later that year. In the first meeting for Another Code, the top priority wasn't on unique puzzles or scenarios that they could introduce using its gimmicks. It was gameplay feel and screen orientation. Kanasaki was adamant that he wanted the game to be played in a quarter view, similar to classic Zelda or Pokemon Colosseum, but this was rejected by the producers from Nintendo, Kira and Shinya Saito, the latter of whom was making his producer debut. They instead wanted the game to be played from a top-down perspective. The reason for this was twofold. Firstly, they could take advantage of the unique features of the DS this way, having a profile view of the characters on the top screen and then controlling Ashley with the touchscreen on the bottom. The second reason was to make it easier for more players to enjoy the game, as the top-down design would appeal to players who aren't good at navigating in 3D spaces. The second point was particularly important to Nintendo, as the company was just starting out its focus on a blue ocean strategy after they saw many core gamers jump ship from Nintendo to Sony over the prior decade. Their blue ocean strategy meant making games that appeal to everyone, from grandchild to grandparent, and Another Code was one of the titles primed to show this off. This decision is also reflected in the art style of the game, which went for a more realistic look. From early concept art for the game and interviews with Kanasaki, the original designs for Ashley had a more stylized, younger appealing art style, reminiscent of manga and anime. But after consulting with Nintendo, who were already planning for the game to be released worldwide, Kanasaki shifted the art style to be more westernized, so that they can appeal to a wider audience, focusing on realism over style, and that led to the designs we have today. On the topic of Ashley, there was a lot of debate over the character, both for her looks and particularly her age. In the earliest drafts of the game, Ashley was 17 years old, but in this pursuit to make Another Code a game that could appeal to all ages, she was aged down to be 14 years old instead. This is because, at the time, Suzuki found that 14 years old is an age demographic that both adults and children can relate to. Ashley is young enough that she is still a child and has to deal with many of the issues that the child players may deal with in real life, but old enough that they can be seen as responsible and more independent, something that adult players can relate to. Likewise, while Ashley is a young girl, her design was made to be androgynous, so that she can be relatable to players of all genders. Kanasaki felt that at 14 years old, as children are going through puberty, it can be difficult for onlookers to tell what gender a teenager might be, and so designed Ashley's hair and sense of fashion and style with this in mind. Similarly, D was also created with the exact same mentality. He is a ghost of the same age as Ashley, so designed to be simple and appealing to anyone across the world. The team at Cing put a huge emphasis on making the game look good, likely because of Kanasaki's history as a graphic and character designer. As the DS was new, they were unsure on how far the game could be pushed graphically, but as development went on, they continued to tweak both the 2D art and 3D graphics and animation as much as possible, with the goal of making a realistic and cinematic experience on the handheld device. They really wanted to capture the worldview of Another Code, and so Kanasaki made various paintings that could be used to promote the game, and made any trailer and cutscenes try to look like it was from a movie, or with the intention of impressing players. While Kanasaki focused on the graphics, Nintendo supported Cing by making sure the gameplay was as user-friendly as possible. This meant working closely with lead programmer Kazuhiko Hagihara and Suzuki to ensure the gameplay was fluid and took full advantage of everything the DS had to offer. Cing took development of this game very seriously, more so than with any other title the developer had previously worked on. Suzuki described her previous work as being made in a very casual environment, but this time around the project planning and management was handled far more professionally. In the end, this allowed the team to create and implement several unique puzzles that made full use of the Nintendo DS system's capabilities. Another Code was first revealed to the public on October 7, 2004, under the working title Another, and would then get its first playable demo during the November 2004 Nintendo World Japanese Tour. It would then later release in Japan under the name Another Code on February 24, 2005. This means the game only had a year of development time, something that feels impossible by today's standard. Then in April, 2 months after the game's Japanese release, Nintendo of Europe confirmed that Another Code would be localized with the subtitle Two Memories, and released on June 24th of that year. Nintendo of America would then wait until E3 2005 to announce that it would be bringing the title to North America later that September, although this would be under the name Trace Memory instead. So why the name change? The exact reasoning has never been given, and it's assumed to be an issue to do with trademarks in the US. But the decision to move from Another Code to Trace Memory wasn't an easy decision either way, as Another is a major part of Another Code's narrative, and this leads us nicely into the story section of today's episode, because Another Code, Two Memories and Trace Memory have some surprising and interesting localization changes. Now, I don't want to spoil the story of Another Code, and I don't plan on going into super specific details, but if you are worried about any spoilers whatsoever, then skip to the timestamp on screen right now. You can always come back and watch this part after you have played and beaten the game. When writing the story for Another Code, Suzuki wanted to get across the idea of memories, and use it as a device to move the story forward. And specifically memories, not recollections, which Suzuki pointed out in an interview with Official Nintendo magazine in 2009, are different things. Memory was a big part of the game's theme, and it was brought about by memories of Suzuki's father, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease. When my father was very young, he lived in Shanghai, and because of the disease he became able to draw very detailed maps of the area, which he couldn't before. That stimulated me to think a lot more about memory. Thankfully, when localized over to the West, the core theme and messaging of Another Code was retained, regardless of region. What changed, however, were several minor details like the renaming of any mention of Another into Trace to match the series' American name. But more importantly, the character of Ashley herself subtly changed in the US localization. In the original Japanese and the European localization of the game, including the UK English release, Ashley comes off as far more reserved, quiet, and generally more accepting of the weird things taking place around her than her US counterpart is. American Ashley was written to instead come off as being far colder, a bit more skeptical and untrusting of the people and events around her, but also a bit more self-confident. It's like the spectrum of a teenager going through puberty. Japanese Ashley keeps to herself more, while American Ashley has far more angst in her. What's interesting about this, and many of the other localization changes made in Trace Memory, is that it was all very intentional. In an interview for Nintendo Power issue 196, Ann Lin of NOA's product development department said, "I think that a believable character, a believable person, would have certain feelings of betrayal, not just acceptance. I wanted to explore that just a little. I think the Japanese text was a little more accepting, not really questioning the weirdness of meeting a ghost or any of the strange circumstances that had befallen her." Anne felt that, given the situation Ashley was finding herself in, with her father actually being alive and her aunt having known this whole time, that Ashley would be far more unforgiving and angry with her family than she actually is in the Japanese script. She wanted to explore these feelings while also adding in more dialogue and comedic moments throughout in order to help humanise the whole cast. Although their take on her character was different from mine, my depiction was based in large part off the game's art style. Visually speaking, Ashley has such a wide range of expressions and emotions that I tried to make the text reflect that complexity as well. Regardless of the localization changes, the core story and concepts that Suzuki wanted to get across to the audience are all still retained, and in some instances that feeling and emotion that the story is asking for are better presented in trace memory. Personally, I don't think the changes are that different, just a few extra lines and alterations here and there. But it will be interesting to see if any of these changes will be adopted in the upcoming Another Code Recollections, which looks to be having a unified English translation that's likely more loyal to the original Japanese. Another Code launched to pretty decent success, and somewhat average reviews. The game sold around 105,000 copies in Japan by the end of 2005, and in the UK it sold about 15,000 units, ranking it as the 32nd best-selling DS game of 2005. In the US, we don't know many specifics, but it seems to have sold just slightly better than it did in Japan, although the only source for this I can find is VG charts, so take it with a grain of salt I guess. Reviews for the game were mixed, but there was some consistent sentiment across the board. Almost every reviewer praised the game's graphics, story, and atmosphere, with many pointing to the game's structure and 2D art as particular highlights of the narrative and presentation. On the other side of the coin though, the game was described as being too easy and too short for an adventure game. Some reviews argued that you could easily beat the story in a single evening, while the puzzles were described as being incredibly unoriginal and archaic, with a handful of exceptions that make great use of the Nintendo DS's hardware, like the infamous stamp puzzle. Overall though, reviewers came out with mostly positive impressions of the game, describing it as a great introduction to the adventure game genre, just one that feels aimed at a very young audience. Which does match up with the Blue Ocean strategy of Nintendo's at the time, when development of Another Code was going on. They wanted to make a game that told a compelling narrative, while also working as an introduction to the genre. And the team at Cing were proud of what they accomplished. In the 2009 interview with Official Nintendo magazine, Suzuki praises the fact that with Cing's titles, anyone can play and enjoy them. No special skills are required. She also attributed the resurgence of the adventure game genre in Japan to be, in part, thanks to Another Code and its success. One thing that I am particularly proud of is that if you go into a game shop in Japan now, there is an adventure corner, and that's something that we feel we've contributed to coming back. Following the successful launch of Another Code, Cing and Nintendo were keen to keep their relationship going, and began developing the classic adventure title Hotel Dusk Room 215. The development of that title, however, is an episode for another day. Instead, we're going to fast forward to 2007, where Cing had just announced its first game for the Nintendo Wii, Little King's Story. And behind the scenes, the company were working closely with Nintendo once more to revisit the world of Another Code and continue Ashley's adventures in Another Code, R, A Journey into Lost Memories. There is significantly less information about the development of this title when compared to the original. Miyagawa, Suzuki, and Kanazaki all returned to the project, although the latter was now solely focused as one of the game's two artists, alongside Keisuke Sakamoto, who handled backgrounds on both this game and the original DS title. The new director was instead Shigeru Komine, who got their start as a planning assistant on Hotel Dusk. Development began following the release of Hotel Dusk, with Suzuki et al. Hoping to take what they had done for the adventure game genre on the DS to a new platform. With the popularity of the Nintendo Wii and the company already having some experience with the hardware thanks to Little King's story, it was the obvious choice. And because this would be Cing's first adventure game on a new platform, it felt fitting for this title to be a follow-up to the DS's first adventure game by them, and thus a sequel to Another Code began development. The game would be set 2 years after the events of the first title, and as the initial Another Code focused on Ashley finding her father, this time it would focus on their relationship, and Ashley learning more about her deceased mother in the process. The theme of memories was once again an important part of the narrative, with Ashley having to recall her repressed memories of the day her mother died, leading to a revelation about the truth of that day. This theme is reflected in the game's title. The R in Another Code R literally stands for revelation. The focus of the story this time around is on the familial relationship between Ashley and her father Richard, as well as the two's relationship with Ashley's late mother Sayoko. I hope players can experience this theme while playing Another Code. Recently, I've been focused on the theme of memories in the works that I've been involved with. It is my belief that memories are the proof of a person's life. When a life turns into a memory, it is then that the memory becomes that person's story. In Another Code, when Ashley opens the door to her memories, Ashley's story begins. There were several decisions made when developing the game's narrative that were designed to make it similar to the original, while other parts were purposefully contrasting. An example of this can be found in the location of the game, Lake Juliet. Ashley is once again thrust by a family member into a strange new location. Ashley is described by the devs as being a city girl, and in the first title she was forced to go to a lonely mansion on an island in the middle of nowhere. Now, she's being forced to Lake Juliet, a campsite in the middle of the countryside, far from any big city. It's a similar experience as the first narrative. However, a campsite was chosen this time because it's a place where several people congregate, and a lot can happen in a single day, a contrast to the lonely atmosphere of the original. Another example of this similar feel but contrasting use is in Ashley's new sidekick Matthew. The developers purposefully made Matthew and Dee very similar in a lot of ways, and both fill the same role as a character that Ashley can bounce her personality off of. But Ashley acts far more childish than Dee ever did. In fact, the devs discussed how in the original game, despite being a child, they never bothered to detail exactly what kind of child Ashley was. Funnily enough, something the NOA localization tried to fix. And so with Matthew, they wanted him to be a character that feels like a child, even if it leads to the player and Ashley herself finding him annoying at times. Following this same philosophy, Ashley's personality was greatly expanded on in Another Code R. The game establishes that she loves music and is an inspiring musician. With more characters to interact with and talk to, Ashley has several characters and relationships that she can bounce off of, showing different sides of her personality based on who she's talking to, whether it be a family member, a friend, or a stranger. And with the power of the Wii, the game could be rendered using full 3D graphics and 3D animations, showing a lot of personality for not just Ashley, but all the characters through their body movement. Nailing this was important to Kanazaki and the graphics team, as was the way that the game would be presented. When development began, the team considered using a similar presentation style to the original, a top-down perspective and character cut-ins for dialogue, but Miyagawa suggested making the game look like a stage play. This idea really appealed to Kanazaki, who became very particular with composition and background elements that would be seen by players. It was decided that Ashley needed to always be the focal point, and the world would morph around her. She was the lead actor in this stage play, and while she can only move left and right, the world will twist and contort to create the illusion that she is moving through a 3D space. Just like actors moving from one scene to another in a stage play involves the props and background being the actual parts that moved, the world would move around Ashley herself, and that would represent exploration. Also, despite the fact that the game was now in 3D, 2D hand-drawn expressions and images still played a key role. Kanazaki was adamant about using 2D art for the facial features and animations in the game, and several puzzles used visual cues to explain mechanics and controls instead of a tutorial. They wanted the players to look at Ashley and put themselves in her shoes, figure out how to solve the puzzle by acting like she would. This is why all the puzzles have an Ashley cut-in on the right side of the screen, so she's always present. When Ashley isn't on screen, the player should be asking, "Where is Ashley?" From a gameplay perspective, Another Code R had the same philosophy as the original DS title: make full use of the hardware gimmicks while making a game that anyone can play with ease. This led to the development of the RAS, an in-game key that looks like a Wii remote. Think of it as the sonic screwdriver from Doctor Who, a device that can basically be used to solve any problem Ashley might have. The game was also designed to be played with one hand, using a single Wii remote for everything, and this was a big part of the marketing for the title. Hilariously, it's technically a big lie, as there is one late game puzzle that requires the use of the nunchuck to solve, but for the most part you only need to use the Wii remote, utilising the motion control and pointer to solve many of the puzzles Ashley would come across. Another Code R was first shown off in 2008 at Nintendo's Autumn Conference alongside titles like Punch-Out Wii and Sin and Punishment 2. The game would then launch 4 months later on February 5th, 2009 in Japan, and then June 19th, 2009 for Europe. While the original game had mixed but mostly positive reviews, Another Code R wasn't as fortunate. Many critics of the game praised its visuals and presentation, as well as the themes its story presented, but criticised that same story for meandering around too much with a lot of pointless back and forth dialogue, especially in the first half of the story. Despite reviewing lower than the original, the game's reputation has seemingly only increased as the years have gone on, with Metro UK calling the game a hidden gem of the Wii, and Chris Schilling of The Telegraph citing it as one of the 10 most underrated games of 2009. Unfortunately, for Another Code R, while reviews and opinions can shift over time, the sales cannot, and Another Code R was very lackluster in this department, selling fewer than 15,000 copies at its Japan launch, and while we don't know exact numbers in Europe, we do know that they weren't very high. And a big factor for the overall sales of this title being fairly low might be because it did not release in the US or Australia. We don't know exactly why Another Code R never made it to America, but considering it never made it to Australia either, despite the fact that they often use the PAL releases so they would have just used the UK one, it's likely because of the initial poor sales and reviews of the game from Japan and Europe. It wasn't seen as worth releasing even if there was an English localization already out there. We've seen this happen before with Disaster Day of Crisis, which saw its North American release cancelled due to poor sales of that game, but it's possible that sales of the original Trace Memory also didn't live up to NOA's expectations, and so bringing the sequel over seemed like a bad move, especially if they were having to do their own localization again, just like with the first game. Ashley Mizuki Robbins and Another Code made a few cameo appearances in Nintendo's crossover fighter, Super Smash Bros. In Brawl, Ashley appeared as a trophy with a new 3D model made for her. The first Another Code also got 3 stickers in the form of Ashley, Jessica and the Captain. Then in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Ashley reappeared as a spirit, this time using her Another Code R appearance instead. But that does it for other appearances of Ashley and anything Another Code related in any official capacity, because unfortunately in 2010, Cing announced that it was going bankrupt, and many of the key members of the Another Code team left and joined Arc Systems Works. The last piece of official Ashley art was this 2010 New Year's art drawn by Kanasaki. Poor Ashley, so hopeful for the terrible year ahead. With the closure of Cing, the Another Code series felt like it was officially dead. Neither game got released on the Wii U Virtual Console, which had both DS and Wii games on its service, and Nintendo proceeded to not acknowledge the series. Not out of any malice, I imagine. There was just no need. Another Code wasn't a big franchise like F-Zero, where even without new games, the IP itself is strong enough to get attention. And Another Code isn't a Nintendo classic like Balloon Fight, where it might just show up in cameo appearances in other Nintendo titles. But despite this, it was clear that Another Code was still beloved amongst fans who did play it, and the old Cing team who had moved on to further pastures. In particular, Kanasaki, who has gone on to work on games like Granblue Fantasy Versus, showed his love for the series by drawing various new pieces of artwork of Ashley as an adult, to celebrate the series' various anniversaries. He's also confirmed that both her and Kyle got happy endings to their stories, which is cute. And for a while, that's all fans expected to see from Another Code. And that's a shame, because as I alluded to at the start of this video, I think Another Code is an important title for Nintendo's history. While it was never a part of the Touch Generations line of games, except for in Europe and only the Wii title, the game has a reputation for being one of those initial Blue Ocean games that showed non-gamers that Nintendo was also for them. In a similar way to Brain Age, Cooking Navi and Clubhouse games, Another Code didn't feel like a typical game in the West, but rather an early showcase for why its genre worked as a video game. Specifically the visual novel / Japanese adventure game genre, and I mean this for a casual audience. Obviously the genre had been around for decades at this point, but it was either Japan only or incredibly niche, usually only acknowledged by Western otaku. But Another Code and then later Hotel Dusk were titles that showed off this genre to a different audience, and may have helped to normalise the genre in the West. Now, I'm not saying that Another Code definitely had a major impact on the Ace Attorney franchise, but it first came to the West a few months after Another Code did, and sold basically the same amount of copies, in a move that shocked Capcom at the time, who weren't expecting the game to be that popular outside of Japan, largely due to its genre. I would be curious to know how many people at the time bought both games. It's also an important game for Nintendo specifically, as it was the first Japanese adventure game they brought to the West. All of the old Famicom adventure games were skipped over because there was a belief that Westerners didn't want narrative-driven story-heavy games, but right from the start of Another Code's development, Nintendo wanted to bring the title to all regions, and it must have done well enough that Nintendo has since brought all of its adventure titles to Western markets, or at least to Europe. Well, except for Buddy Mission Bond, but that game has other issues preventing it from coming over. Another Code paved the way for the genre to grow outside of Japan, and allowed for games like the Famicom Detective Club remake to be given a worldwide launch. And it's this legacy and reputation that may have helped the Another Code franchise reach the position it currently finds itself in. September 2023 rolls around and Nintendo releases their usual September Nintendo Direct, and it's in this that they announced Another Code Recollection for the Nintendo Switch, a full remake of the first two games released together as one title, launching worldwide on January 19th, 2024. Now, as of writing and recording, and hopefully the release of this video, Another Code Recollection isn't actually out yet, and there have been no interviews with the developers, so we aren't totally sure how this remake came about, but we can speculate based on a couple of facts that we do know, so just bear that in mind as I go through this last final segment. In 2019, Nintendo was asked at an investors meeting about whether the current version of Nintendo would be able to make adventure games like they used to, citing Famicom Detective Club as an example. Shigeru Miyamoto then responded saying, "Nowadays, games are localized in over 10 languages, and adventure games' localization costs are massive in terms of voices and text. Furthermore, younger gamers trend towards being uninterested in this genre. However, designing adventure game mechanics is fun, and are used well in Capcom's Ace Attorney and Level 5's Professor Layton series, so while we can still have hope for the genre, please understand that actively making one is hard in the current mainstream." This seems like a bad sign for adventure game fans, however literally 2 months later, Nintendo would announce a partnership with Mages to remake the first two Famicom Detective Club games for Nintendo Switch, and these would be given a worldwide release in 2021. So despite what Miyamoto stated, Nintendo must have seen a market for games like this still, and were willing to fund them. They just didn't want to do it themselves internally anymore. Then you have the Ace Attorney series from Capcom, arguably the most popular adventure game in the current gaming landscape, and sales for this franchise have continued to increase with each release, ever since the launch of the Ace Attorney trilogy. Right now, we appear to be in a renaissance for the Japanese adventure game genre, and I think Kanazaki et al. Saw this and realised that it was their chance. We know that Kanazaki is returning as art director once more, and thanks to the demo Nintendo released in December 2023, we know that the game is being developed by Arc Systems Works, where many of the old Cing staff moved to, including Takeya Miyagawa, so he is likely involved in the project as well. Series writer Rika Suzuki didn't go with them to Arc System Works, as she formed her own company once again, this one called Bellwood, and moved to making smartphone and web apps. It wouldn't surprise me though if she does turn out to be involved in some capacity. We will definitely find out soon though when the game launches, and hopefully it does well. I'm sure if it can prove itself as a success, remakes of the Hotel Dusk duology won't be out of the question, and we may enter a Cing renaissance, which would make the future of the Another Code series look very bright. Now just a quick aside, but for recent titles, Nintendo has been releasing these little interviews with the developers in a similar style to the oldie What Are Asks, and so it is entirely possible that this happens for another Code Recollection. Unfortunately, I'm not a time traveller, I can't go to the future and access information I don't have for this video, and I wanted to get this out ahead of the Another Code Recollection launch to try and spread awareness of the IP and help support it in finding success, and ride off that sweet algorithm. But to try and make this video not feel incomplete, I will be linking to any interview that releases on the collection in the description below, so go and check that shortly when this video ends and learn some more about the history of one of Nintendo's most beloved adventure games. And hey, while you're down there, why not do me a favour and hit that lovely looking subscribe button? Maybe even leave a comment letting me know if you learned anything in this video? Maybe this is how you found out about the series, I'd love to hear it, and I'd also love to hear what other games you want me to cover in a future episode of the Nintendo Chronicler. There's a few I have already begun researching, but I'm happy to add more to the list if you want to see it. And with that, I'm going to go play some Another Code Recollection. I've been holding off on trying that demo myself until this video is out. Hopefully it can tide me over until the game releases. Which, given how late this video took to release, is probably like tomorrow.